My wife Jennifer recently had a DNA test through Ancestry.com, and the results were quite surprising. I found out that she was not from this planet at all. She says she's from Venus. Anyway, just kidding. What I did find out, though, and she gave me full permission to talk about that a little bit because it leads to a greater point, showed that she had 30% genetic history from Ireland, Scotland and Wales, 21% from Western Europe, including Southeast England, 14% from Scandinavia, 5% from Portugal and Spain, 4% from Eastern Europe, 1% from Finland, 1% from Italy and Greece, 1% from Iran, Syria and Turkey, and 3% from India, Nepal, and Pakistan. Isn't that interesting that just by a simple saliva test that you can find out that kind of thing about your physical lineage? And I'm going to have that test done too because I'm curious. But find out what planet I'm from. But, from physical genetics, that's one point. But in a greater sense, as we awaken, we intuit that is only one level of our being. That our physical body, even though that's a fascinating topic to look at our physical genetics, is only an aspect of a temporary existence. And I want to speak to some deeper aspects of who we are today. One level, and last week we talked about levels, that on a certain level we're energy. On another level, like we're body, mind, and soul, the trinity of self. Body, mind, and soul with spiritual presence animating us as we live and move and have our being in God, in spirit. And to me, the essence of this work is looking at body and mind, but also soul. And that you and I are on an eternal path as an eternal individuality. And I like to call it soul. And that as we have been birthed into our physicality and our body-mind, which has all the requirements of belonging and being seen and heard and appreciated and all of that, there is a greater self that is continually knocking at the door, and that we are continually desiring on a certain level to allow to come forth. And that even the topics that we entertain here on Sunday, the music, all of it is an invitation to align ourselves with soul, our eternal identity. So that we are able to allow the body-mind to be quieted. And we have certain needs that need to be met within our personal self, our personality. And persona means mask. So that we live within a consciousness of soul to where we recognize that body, mind, and personality is and are just aspects of what it is that we are. That underneath that, we have an identity of soul that is the witness and the watcher of those aspects, so that we aren't pushed around pillar to post and influenced by others' opinions or trend and style and what's up, what's cool, what's happening now. I mean, all of that is relatively important to being in the body-mind self, where we feel belonging and we're hip and all of that, which really is a cry of love. To wanting to be appreciated and seen and heard is a cry for love. All of that's relatively important. But what is really important is the bringing forth of the self, the deeper self that is our permanent being. And that any spiritual tradition that's worth its salt will be about this uncovering process, so that we live free. Even if we are in a situation of outer bondage, we can choose whom we will serve through our inherent knowing our identity. In my church, in our church in Tennessee, some years ago now, almost 9 or 10 years ago now, Tennessee is an interesting place. And that was a good learning experience for us. The people were a bit more conservative than they are here. And I told them that I was going to speak about Genesis. And they thought that that was about the book in the Bible, Genesis. But it wasn't. When I'm speaking about Genesis, I'm talking about levels of being. And that there are 3 levels that I would like to approach with you this morning. For if we are strictly identified with being our physical genetic history, we could say, well, I'm Irish, or I'm English, or I'm from Turkey, or Mexico, or India. And that has something to do with what I'd like to call tribal genesis. Tribal genesis is an identity of being from a certain area on the earth that says, yeah, that's who I am. And that's good enough. And for much of humanity, that is good enough. Tribal genesis. But then, as you may have noticed in the last 60 or 70 years, there has been an arising of something else. A personal genesis. Personal rights, human rights, women's rights, that which calls from within to say, I will not be bound by the strict definition of tribal genesis. I am property of no one. I am me. And I remember when I was younger, people talking about the me generation, that the baby boomers were the me generation. Well, that had to do with personal genesis, of kind of staking a claim in being individualized. But that was only a secondary level. Because what I'm speaking about is really moving from circumference to center, Tribal Genesis being an outer definition of self that, yes, I belong to the group, and the group is anything from a person of a certain country or a person of a certain football team, or I'm a Canadian, or I'm an American, or. And then as consciousness evolves, there is this going to the next level, which is personal Genesis. That you are perhaps looked at by those within your tribe of past as, well, he or she is the black sheep because they're just kind of moving at a different beat. And you may leave that tribe. You may go from Toronto to Vancouver because you want to find yourself. And that is all relatively important. But it's pointing to the center from a circumference. And that center is really the self with a capital S, or the soul Genesis. And that is the core of what, at least for myself as a unity trained minister, even that is an identity. Could even be thought of, unity could be thought of as a tribe in and of itself. But that's not where it ends, because the teachings, the Christ teachings, the teachings of truth with a capital T, point to the center of self. And isn't that what we're doing in meditation every time we sit on our bones, as they say, our sitting bones, where everybody's sitting right now? You're sitting in the quiet of your own being. And what is that process about? That's about letting go of these other layers of self and tribal genesis to say, you know, I'm not going to allow that to bother me, and I'm not going to allow this. I deny that those have power over me, and I affirm the truth of being. That is the royal road inward to the self, which is what we're talking about, self-genesis. There are other levels of genesis, cosmic genesis, which are really beyond the scope of this conversation. They exist as when people have experiences of oneness, or as Paramahansa Yogananda said, samadhi, or when Charles Fillmore had moments of great oneness with divine mind, or any other great teacher in New Thought or East or West. But those are outside really of the realm of practicality. The practical is that we are within and aligned ourselves with our self-genesis, with a capital S, our soul genesis. And from that point, we live and move and have our being. Because I can't tell you how many times people that are caught up in tribal or self-genesis with a cap or with a small s are in suffering. We suffer when we are aligned with just tribalism and not knowing who we are as spiritual beings, when we are aware of ourselves as a spiritual being living in a spiritual universe and governed by spiritual law, and we feel the imprint of the Genesis within us on a soul level, we are free. The voice in the head is not me. I am that which chooses to react or not to react to that voice. And knowing this, I am free. That is the voice of the spiritual soul within you. That is the voice of God within that says, I will not be bound by the limitations of someone else's opinion. I will to will thy will. This is the essence of the core of the Christ teachings. The teachings of Jesus the Christ are not about Christianity. They are showing the essence, the way of living from the inside out, from living from soul, from living from this essence which moves into personal Genesis, moves into tribal Genesis. And if you had noticed, Jesus was not accepted in his own town. He was a threat to the tribes of Israel, because of everything that was so fixed, right? In tradition, in what Charles Fillmore called race consciousness. But it was the fulfillment. It was the fulfillment of a divine idea. It is said in Unity teachings that God holds for each of us. In his book, The Soul's Code, The Search of Character and Calling, the author James Hillman, who was a great thinker, psychologist, and Jungian analyst, talks about two things, well, many things, but what I chose was the distinction between the acorn theory and ancestry, personal ancestry. The acorn theory is much like the metaphor of the butterfly, and the caterpillar to the chrysalis to the butterfly. That the acorn has within it an imprint, what he calls a daemon. And I want to spell that word so that you don't think I'm saying demon. Okay? Daemon is D-A-I-M-O-N. And that means the imprint of its own greatness, its own divine mission. And he talks about people, artists, musically or fine artists, and other people in history, like Mozart or Gandhi. But he also talks about people like Eleanor Roosevelt and Jackson Pollock that had tremendous trials when they were children. And I looked at that and I said, that's relatable, because you and I each have this incredible acorn imprint within each one of us. That these people aren't exceptions. They are only, as David Icke stated when talking about acorns. He said, David Icke stated that today's oak is just yesterday's nut that stood its ground. And you know what? Sometimes this feeling inside of us, this divine potential that propels us away from tribal Genesis and personal Genesis, and it propels us to pay attention to our own soul, sometimes makes us feel like a nut. And other people will say, you're nuts. You shouldn't do that. You should be safe. You should play it safe. Don't follow. It's not okay to walk outside of the agreed parameters of life. And those of us that feel this daemon, this imprint, this blueprint of the self with a capital S, say, I'm going to feel the fear and do it anyway. Because if I don't do it, I will be compromising my own being to such an extent that I will literally die. It is calling me to be what I am. And I have struggled with this personally my whole life. I feel this deep sense of this imprint, as I'm sure you do too. And we compromise ourselves, don't we? We compromise this inner imprint by playing it safe. Gandhi, it's said of Gandhi that he was sickly and ill and wanted to stay home when he was a child. He was afraid of ghosts and spiders and snakes. But that was due to, in a way, of what he chose as a soul to come into a life, into a body, into a situation where he had to have an overcompensation in order to rise up out of that limitation. And he, on a level of soul, he would not put up with the power structure within South Africa or in India. He said, no, I will to be. I will to be that which I am. That is the strength and the power of the indwelling daemon or imprint within us. And each one of us have this. It is within you. At home, I have a sign across from where I sit at my desk. It's just a foot or two away. It just simply says, God, what do you want me to do now? And now, and now, and now, and now. What do you want me to do in this moment? And I have a very strong-willed mental faculty that says, well, I'm going to do it what I want to do, as many people do in this room. But when we dig in our heels and we say, no, I'm going to do what I want to do, especially when we have this inner imprint that is calling us into greater life, that's when we suffer. That's when we stress, when we resist. And life is so much more beautiful when we just simply say, God, what do you want me to do now? I do that before I come here during the week. God, what do you want me to do now? In stewardship of this place. What do you want me to do, God? I'm here on assignment. What do you want me to do? Not my will, but thy will be done. So, I had another little reading in here from this wonderful book, Love Poems from God. And this is in closing, this is a man who lived between 1440 and 1518. His name is Kabir. It says, for 500 years, the poems of Kabir have been recited and sung throughout India. Kabir was a great religious reformer in his time, as well as a famous artist and musician, founding a sect that still claims to have 1 million followers. Kabir achieved a remarkable synthesis of Hinduism, Muslim, and even Christian belief. So he had this strong daemon within himself that investigated truth and investigated who it is that we are. And I love this because it's kind of radical. The smart dogs ran off. This is what it's called. I sat one day with a priest who expounded on the doctrine of hell. I listened to him for hours, then he asked me what I thought of all he said. And I replied, "That doctrine seems like an inhumane cage. No wonder the smart dogs ran off." And you know what? That has a certain amount of shock value to it. Because when you think about religion, there's a certain adherence to a certain way, a certain genesis of a way of being that we're supposed to adhere to. And I would, I guess in a way, be part of a priesthood. But it's not about a cage for any of us. It's really about opening up the doors of the cage and walking out into the light, into the depth of who it is that we are. And if I was going to proscribe an old way of adherence in religiosity, I would not be paying attention to my own indwelling daemon, self. And neither would you. So I would suggest that your homecoming work this week, if you choose to accept it, is to spend time in a place of saying, what is the inner acorn imprint within me trying to say? Oh, I did have something else that I wanted to say too. No, that's not it. That's about Grandparents' Day. Thank you, though. Oh, this was Marianne Williamson. She said, Marianne Williamson, she said, embryos turn into babies, buds turn into blossoms, acorns into oak trees. The same programming that exists in them exists in us to manifest our highest potential. What is the difference between those things and us? And her response is that we have the ability to say no. And then she reframes it and simply says, why not say yes? Why not say yes to our own actual design? So that's another piece of the homework this coming week, if you choose to accept it, is to look at where we, and I include myself in this, where we say no to allowing the light from within us to be. Where do we say no? And finding those places and reframe them and saying yes. Yes to the potential of who we are. Yes to life. Yes to being of service. Yes to being fully self-expressed. Yes to loving ourselves. Yes to picking up the phone and calling somebody that we haven't for a long time because we have a grudge and saying, I love you. I'm sorry for what happened. Yes. Thank you.
So walk on, mile by mile, walk on a little smiling, walk on, and so come what may.